Good morning. Today we're going to continue our study of Amos. We're going to look at chapters 3 and 4. So between chapter 2 and 3, there may have been a time lapse, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But chapters 3 through 6 actually have these sermons against northern Israel, the northern kingdom. And they start with "hear the word," and that is listing the judgments, the reasons why there will be judgment. And then they end with "therefore," and here's what's going to happen because of those reasons. So the first sermon is chapter 3. So go ahead and pause me and read chapter 3. Okay, go ahead. Chapter 3 is the first sermon, and there's 3 reasons in verses 1 through 10 for judgment. And the first one is Israel's ingratitude in the face of God's goodness, His love. Israel is God's family. He loves them. They're His covenant people, and they've just acted like no, not really. So they're just not very grateful for their place in His family. And in verses 3 through 6, so we have these rhetorical questions. Does the lion roar in the thicket when he has no prey? These rhetorical questions, and they end in verse 6 when he says, "What when disaster happens? Has God caused it?" Well, yeah, God has let it happen. I mean, God controls everything. But so He's given these previous warnings, and they've just kind of ignored them. And in verse 8, it says, but God's spoken. God has spoken. So you have ignored the warnings, and now God has spoken. And the third reason for judgment is that, and this is in verse 10, they just don't even know how to do right. These northern kingdom Israelites they don't even know how to do right. So tell everybody, our enemies in Ashdod, which is Philistia / Palestine, and Egypt, tell everybody, these people don't even know how to do right. They don't even know what right is. So in verse 11, it starts so here's 3 things that you've done, and here's what's going to happen. Therefore, an enemy will destroy your house, and only the poorest and most helpless will be left in Israel. So it talks about a lion leaving only a bone or two. So we talked about a lion's den. It's full of the grossest stuff, only the stuff that the lion can't eat. So it's anything of value, any person of any value is going to be shipped off. And the altars will be destroyed. So the horns on the altars. So these altars of these pagan gods generally had 4 corners and 4 horns, one on each corner. And they served, depending on who you read, 2 purposes. One is they strung ropes from them to hang the meat on to cook. And the other one was these horns. If you had a hold of a horn, you were in a place of sanctuary. So a criminal could grab hold of the horn and be safe. Again, I don't know how long they could hold on, but that's the story that goes with it. So the significance here is God says, I'm taking off the horns. So there's no refuge. I'm taking away your place of refuge, and I'm taking away your food, and I'm taking away your altar. And also, therefore, your great houses are going to be destroyed. And it talks about these winter houses and summer houses and lake houses and beach houses and mountain houses and chalets. And, how much like this people are we? I'm just saying. So that's the end of the first sermon. The second sermon starts or is in chapter 4, the whole chapter. So go ahead and pause me again and read chapter 4. Okay, chapter 4, again, the judgment has 3 reasons. And one was the wrong living of society women. My favorite verse in the Bible. Well, okay, not my favorite verse. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is, it starts, hear this word, which is the beginning of the sermon, the beginning of, here's the reasons you deserve judgment, you cows of Bashan. Bashan was this very lush grazing plain where cows got really fat. And they were known as fat cows of Bashan. And so you'll hear people sometimes say, and when I first heard it, it was fat cows of Bashan. And he's talking about the women. He's talking about the women of Samaria. And they're they're craving comfort and pleasure. Yeah, that kind of hits home, doesn't it? And he's calling them fat cows. And there's that cow word, and there is no fat anywhere. It's just kind of a given. The word cows is K-I-N-E in Hebrew, and it could mean an effeminate man, but it probably means women. I just love that. I mean, Amos is a farmer, and he doesn't mince words, and he talks in very earthy language, and he's just saying to these women, you fat cow. Love it. In verse 2, he talks about the people being led away with these fish hooks, and in reality, when Assyria took over the northern kingdom, they did have, they put hooks in their noses and in their lips, and they tied ropes through them and literally led them away that way. There's apparently pictures of them doing that in Assyrian etchings, and it's pretty gross. So the second judgment was for this wrong worship at Bethel and Gilgal. So they still had these false gods, in particular Baal and Ashtoreth. And so King Jeroboam, when the kingdom had first split in the northern kingdom, King Jeroboam had said, you know what? It's too far to go to Jerusalem to worship. And really what he was saying was, I don't want people to go to Jerusalem. I want my people to stay north of that little line there. And so it's okay to worship at Bethel. And I'm going to set up this altar there that's just going to be like Jerusalem. But, oh, by the way, you're going to be able, you people, you can worship Baal if you want to. All worship was supposed to be in Jerusalem. And there was obviously not supposed to be any idol worship. And so that, again, this worship, these false gods, this supposed to be in Jerusalem. In addition, in verse 4 and 5, they're talking about things that they're giving that they're not, that they're overdoing it. So they're giving too many tithes, and they're giving, having too many sacrifices. And then it goes on to talk about the leavened bread. And leavened bread, again, that's a no-no. That's a no-no. Leavening is kind of equated with a symbol of evil. So you're supposed to have unleavened bread. They were bragging about their free will offerings. And free will offerings were supposed to be between you and God and the priest. And nobody else was supposed to know. So basically what they're doing is they're being very much of Pharisees, even before there were Pharisees. And they're saying, oh, I'm so good. I gave this to the church, and I gave this to St. Jude, and I gave this to United Way. You know, nobody needs to hear that. And those things are, you're doing that to pump yourself up, not to pump God up. So the third reason for judgment in this second sermon is these 5 previous warnings. So God says, I gave, I withheld, I struck, I sent, I overthrew. 5 things I did for you, and they were negative. and they were to wake you up. I gave you a lack of food. I made you hungry so you would wake up and see. I gave you a drought. I withheld rain. So, yes, you would wake up and come back to me. So you would realize I'm in control. I struck crops and vineyards. Again, warning, you ignored it. 4, I sent plagues. In Egypt, people started taking note at this point. These guys are oblivious. Even though they knew that this had happened in Egypt. I sent plagues. Oh yeah, you ignored them. I overthrew. This goes back to that little lapse between chapter 2 and 3. Most people think this overthrowing had to do with this earthquake that happened, and you'll remember that Amos in chapters 1 and 2 prophesied that there would be an earthquake. Well, this earthquake apparently had happened at this point of this writing. So I gave you an earthquake. Guess what? You have not yet returned to me. I gave you all these warnings, and you have not yet returned to me. So in verses 12 and 13, he says, therefore, so you did these things, here's what's going to happen. Prepare to meet your God. That's pretty straightforward right there. Verse 13 goes on to talk about how God controls the earth, God controls nature, God controls everything. You better prepare to meet your God. Pretty good stuff in Amos. We'll continue with the sermons, with the third sermons tomorrow. That's sermons 1 and 2. And I'll see you then.